Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us today and for registering for today's masterclass, which is a review of 2023 from Catherine Cockhill from Hotstats. Many of you will know Catherine already from Hotspace and other industry events. It's 10:30 a.m. It's Tuesday, the 20th of February, 2024, and we're due to be live with you today for around 30 minutes. And if there is time for questions, we will take them. Please do put your questions in using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And if there's not enough time to answer all the queries, we'll get back to you afterwards. I'm Jane Pendlebury. I'm CEO of HOSPA, the Hospitality Professionals Association, and I'm now just going to hand you over to Catherine to take us through the review of 2023, and I'll pop back on at the end. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that will all work, and you will be able to see my screen now. So good morning, and so we're going to have a quick zip through for about 20-25 minutes through the results and the outcome of 2023 and how it look at how it might impact things for us this year. But before we do that, just a quick date on where we are with contributor numbers and basically our products, what we offer, in case any of you are not sure. So as you can see, we are now at around 12,500 hotels worldwide, which is a big growth number since where we were in 2018, which was around 3,000. So there's been a huge amount of growth in interest, and that's really because people need data, as we know. In terms of what we offer, there are three different types of that base product. There's internal benchmarking, where a hotel group can benchmark each hotel within that group separately against an internal set or against the whole group. Into external benchmarking, which is for hotels using either free national regional sets that are pre-organized or a specific set of hotels that they've chosen. And then on top of that, there are also the market insights part of the business, which can be a one-off report or a bundle of reports, or actually even a subscription to a comp set so that you can watch the progress over the year. And all of these can be used for feasibility studies or market research. And we are actually about to launch, very excitingly, a big new development in our market tracker. And of course, the most exciting new product is going to be Profit Finder. This is a bit of a sneak preview of the next generation, which builds on the website data that we already offer, and not only offers insight into where the profitability opportunities are, but also shows how much money is actually being left on the table. And it allows you to set up projects and tracking for each specific opportunity that you deem to be the most important for you in terms of growing your profitability versus your comp set. And you can have that via by department and against a variety of comp sets as you need them. So how do we at Hotstats use that contributed hotel data to put together a picture of what's happening? And I know I've said this many times before, and those of you who hear me speak will have heard this a lot, but the importance of the up-to-date detailed information about where the opportunities for revenue lie, where the segmentation opportunities and possibilities sit, and where the cost implications are catching up with you. It's never really been more important than it is now. So we're going to have a look at 2023 and what a year it's been. We were all aware of the fact that we were all very sure that we now have emerged from that global pandemic. But of course, there has also been and is continuing to be the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, once more seemingly being dragged into a mounting crisis. And of course, the impacts of rampant inflation and soaring costs on all sides have all had their impact on our business. So let's see the detail on how all of this has impacted performance. Starting with that recovery position, looking at the overall picture by key department, it's clear that rooms and in fact ADR is still driving actually to quite an astonishing level, full 10 percentage points higher than same time last December. Remember, this is data, year-end data. It's the line that's holding up that total revenue piece, as we'll see, with occupancy levels in some cases not quite having regained their pre-pandemic levels. That overall food and beverage picture is impacted by less breakfast revenue. And of course, conference and banqueting, as you can see in the purple line, is still struggling. If we have a look at actual occupancy by asset class now, rather than the index, so that you can see the trend over the last 2 years, extended stay has continued to do well. It had all of that increased exposure to new travellers who might not have experienced that type of accommodation before the pandemic. and maybe have fallen in love with all that space and that flexibility and having a fridge, etc. And is maybe starting to see a slight falling away now. But in this overall picture, things look fairly positive overall, especially for luxury, at nearly 9 percentage points higher than the same time last year. But we will see a slightly different occupancy picture when we drill down to city by city view that I'm just using to give you some examples of what's available. When I cut that data in a different way, you kind of see a slightly different picture. Looking at the ADR now, average daily accommodation rate, and we see all the ADRs growing as we've known versus last year, except for government, which has actually declined slightly versus 2022. And I should just say this is direct government business, not that coming via a travel agent. Negotiated transient tours still seeing growth versus 2022, and this really continues to speak to that clear commercial plan to continue to drive the required revenue growth from all segments because it is supporting that overall profitability. We will see the impact on the mix as that traditionally the lower rated business mix changes. And it all just underlines how much the ADR has supported profitability, because that cost creep is really driving back into the picture and actually has become a little bit of a cost gallop. When we look at this split by full service and limited or select service, and this really shows how much the gap, I thought this was interesting data to show how much that gap between the two has narrowed in the last 12 to 18 months, with limited service really driving rate in all segments. And if we look at the ADR by key segments for London first, so that we can break it down regionally. For London, you can see very clearly which segment is driving that rate. Retail has seen a softening in growth versus 2022. That's hotel website or brand.com, but it is still well ahead of 2019 levels. OTAs, which we were all constantly watching and which sit in the discount segment and therefore also drive that cost of acquisition, which is of course very high in the OTA segment. There could also be some pressure here as well from corporate demand, who perhaps now have less access to those negotiated rates because they just weren't agreed, because the rates were too high, and are booking through these channels as well. Although I would just say we can't track the actual sources because we don't have access to channel data specifically. Negotiated business, so that's your local corporates, grown by 24% in terms of ADR versus 2019. And that really tells that story and the growth in corporate rooms ADR as well. That could hint at an increased demand for more events in group bookings because usually the rates are increased when there is increased demand and the opportunity becomes, availability becomes smaller. But we'll see as we move through the slides whether this is actually the case. Looking at the provinces then, and here again, following a similar pattern, albeit at lower rates, of course, except for retail or the hotel's website, where the trend looks very different to London and in an encouraging way, seeming to focus on direct business, maybe perhaps more than the city. And of course, this business offers the lowest cost of acquisition and offers the best in terms of relationships with your customers. The direct customer gives you the data you need to analyze to help you know what's working and offer insight into how best to attract them as returners in the future. Negotiated, also following the same trend with a 10% growth versus 2019. And we also see significant growth in the corporate group ADR. So that's anything over 10 rooms as a block, with a 15% growth in this segment since 2019. And now we can actually see the revenue mix by key segment. For London first, you can clearly see the negotiated element has reduced significantly with a decline versus 2019 of 36%. Corporate has stayed entirely flat, and this puts that increased demand question to bed. For London at least, it's possible that the rate impact here on this segment now really has peaked, and it's interesting to see where this might have gone. And perhaps when we look at the next slide, we will see that. And looking at the provinces now, we see a similar picture as far as negotiated goes, but quite a different one for corporate, where we see a 34% growth in the mix, which doesn't appear to have been impacted by that 15% ADR growth that we looked at 2 slides ago for this segment. Clearly, this business is finding a place outside of London with maybe easier access, possibly and probably free parking, more accessible rates. And anecdotally, at least, talking to hoteliers about how this is impacting possibly an easier staffing situation for some. This is the same picture almost exactly that we saw in Q3 last year. And clearly that trend for 2024 is going in the same direction. So very much something to consider depending on where you are in the country. Looking now at that occupancy challenge versus the total revenue gain, and this is one of my maybe favourite views of what's happening, where we might strike a note of caution, continued caution in that trend for 2024. Hotels have been doing more with less, and the ADR definitely has been there to carry it and head off some of those economic wins. However, it's something we're keeping a steady eye on, because with the potential of that softening demand, those leisure elements which were so strong in 2022 and 2023 may now struggle. Focus on this is, of course, very important to maintain that total revenue piece. And it's the costs which are creating that pressure, as I've said, as well as the occupancy number reduction. ADR is that crucial element that's holding the profitability puzzle together, but getting the balance right is going to be even more important in 2024, when the ADR and other revenue increases, which we enjoyed so much over last year, potentially start to soften. So looking now at conference and banqueting, or meeting and events, depending on where you come from and what your background is. So this is revenue per square metre, and it's a really useful metric when trying to understand what the space that you have is delivering for you on property or as part of your group portfolio. And I've used this global slide to give the issue some context, because it isn't just here that things are tricky. Looking at the orange line and in blue versus 2019, versus 2022, and then the blue is variance of 2019. And although all cities around the world increased their revenues in this area versus 2 years ago, London, Birmingham, let's pick out Berlin, Amsterdam, and in fact Paris, actually all well behind 2019. It's good to see Manchester making some gains here. And if anybody needs to know, of course, what's happening in their own cities, I'm really happy to share this afterwards. Just send me an email. I can show you what's there. I will just say that the more of you that contribute in your data, the more of you will then have access to this data for yourselves versus your comp set, and give you some pointers as to where the opportunities might be. Looking at some of the other revenue streams then, and this is the percentage change for UK per available room. And very clearly, the joy of golf has not gone away. We see its impact still very strong. Those golf clubs, which were bought during the pandemic, continue to drive significant demand. Outlet revenue, as we've seen, the UK is struggling, driven by that continuing gap in occupancy, but also perhaps by the growth of on-property food delivery from outside sources. And this is something we started to see at the beginning of, or towards the end of 2022 into 2023. And this does continue to be a thing. And it is something that more and more hoteliers are talking to us about and wanting to run some specific projects on. They want to know, do they have the offer right? Do they have the right price point for the segment they're attracting? What is the data what do the benchmarks look like? And how the best to capture the opportunities, the question, because people, of course, are still eating. It's just a question of what and how they're accessing it. I'll just mention attrition here. It's an interesting post-pandemic growth area, which I've mentioned before. The bulk of that is actually attrition rather than cancellation. And that is groups not fulfilling their food and beverage or rooms contracted consumption. And those contracts are being upheld in a way that they weren't prior to the pandemic. Hoteliers are definitely holding organisers to contracts in a way that perhaps they might not have done. They've now got used to the fact that this revenue is there. And I will just say, though, that this has reduced versus 2022. Back in 2022, we were looking at around 60% attrition growth versus 2022, I should say, rather than where we are now, which is at 44%. So perhaps slightly starting to slip away. It's an interesting development, depending on which size of that contracting relationship you're sitting on, and definitely worth keeping an eye on for your own business. So let's have a look at some of the actual costs involved by city from a cost of acquisition point of view as part of rooms revenue. And we're looking at total booking costs here versus 2019, a real mixture of what's being paid. And of course, this includes OTA commissions. And as you would expect, so where the ADRs are higher, you would expect to see a higher cost of acquisition. Birmingham has surprised me, though, because with an ADR of £98 versus Edinburgh with 157, clearly there is more to this. And it's well worth looking at what you're paying and whether the mix is the best one you can achieve to manage these costs and the profitability that you're getting as a result. And just to take a quick look at some other fee areas, with the exception of Manchester. So this is franchise affiliation and loyalty. Every single city is seeing a big increase again in this area, something to be aware of, so that you have that in your mind when you're looking at where you're looking for business. Loyalty is, of course, hugely important. You know, it's bringing back guests, it's having those relationships, it's understanding your segmentation and who's staying in your hotel, and bringing them back as often as you can, and their families, of course. But it is an on cost. And it sometimes can be hidden in that drive, in that important area of driving loyalty programs in particular. So it's just something to be aware of. And so onto the painful area of other costs. And we can see linen at plus 29%, credit card commissions plus 20%, housekeeping labour plus 33%, which is a massive on cost for hotels and is perhaps the biggest impacting cost growth. Seeing rooms where the daily cleaning costs extra, or hotels are offering F&B vouchers in place of that daily clean. Those things that came in sort of end of 22, beginning of 2023 are absolutely still in place and being expanded in some cases. What a guest expects in a room still remains an interesting topic. Much, of course, had been stripped out, if not everything. And of course, to remain competitive, all of this had been monitored. And we're talking here about water and espresso, magazines in the room, bathroom amenities. There's a whole ESG question around this, of course, as well. All of these things have come back at higher costs. And also what the brand requires as part of the differentiation elements, such as executive lounges, they're also an important part of this picture. And the overall pressure to stick to those brand promises is definitely not going away. Other rooms expenses, just to say, to be clear about what that is, are the rooms department's share of training expenses, decorating costs, and equipment rental, things like ice machines and shoe shining machines. All of these were taken out pretty much entirely during the pandemic years, but they have all come back with a vengeance as recovery is now complete. And so to the overall labour question, I've shown here UK versus Europe. Both regions still doing more with less people. Looking at this, especially interesting for the UK, where we consider wage inflation and what hotels are paying to entice staff back. In Europe, the overall cost has increased by €3, whereas in the UK, the cost has declined per available room. Less people for sure, as we know the salaries have gone up significantly, and as well as they should, to entice that next generation into our industry, because a lack of people is still a real struggle. But of course, the impact on the bottom line, even with the revenue increases that we've seen, is clear to see when we look at the end of the presentation. So moving on now to what's developing to be kind of one of the biggest headaches for hoteliers everywhere in the world, and that is the decline in F&B profitability overall. Looking back to same time 2019, profitability in terms of the margin has declined by around 34% for Europe and 27% for the UK. And clearly the kind of profit levels that we were used to enjoying in the late 2018s and 19s are just simply not there anymore. We do appear to be seeing a real reset here that's posing all kinds of questions around what we need to be planning for in the years to come, from a staffing point of view, from an offer point of view. And outsourcing, repurposing of space, more flexible options so that traditional food and beverage spaces can be sold more often for different kinds of activities, with different atmospheres around them. All of these are key areas for discussion now. And when we look at outlet revenue per available room, obviously there are some significant differences, but apart from Cardiff, which is seeing significant decline, the trend is all roughly back to pre-pandemic levels. I added Rome in here, as Italy is actually the only country that I was able to find, looking at all the data, that's bucking that profitability trend for the reasons that we're going to see in a moment. And in fact, when I add Italy into the equation, not only are they not declining in that country, but things are actually in a better place by 6%. When we look at the staffing situation, and this is the labour margin, every single city in the UK is moving in an upwardly mobile direction, as you can see, whereas in Rome, this is just not the case. And when we look at some of the increases, I would say that as an attempt to move beyond the message that our industry is badly paid, we are moving in the right direction for sure. But the impact of what profit looks like versus what people are prepared to pay may be another question. Looking at the profit margins for food and beverage further afield, just to give a kind of we're not the only ones out there in this situation. The position is very clear. Again, look at Rome. I would just say that New York, with its very high levels of unionisation and where the F&B labour margins sit at around 87%, has challenges that outpace pretty much everyone else's. And that's really all to do with the unionisation situation. But we really are getting to the point where for some hotels and groups, the question is no longer what sort of offer do we put in place? Rather, do we offer anything beyond breakfast? And do we ask someone, a specialist, for example, to take this on? So almost at the end now, and just looking at the current utility position, Southern Europe, which I put in because that was the kind of lowest part of their year for their usage in terms of air conditioning, back to its 2022 levels. And the UK is still well below that £11.19 that we were sitting at in January 2022. But the worrying upward trajectory is the area for concern, and something that we'll be keeping a close eye on for sure, especially for those coming to the end of a longer term contract and trying to work out what they should do next. And there are a lot of consultants that are talking to us around the importance of working with an organisation that's experienced in the management and hedging of utilities in this area could be a useful consideration. Finally, 2 more slides, just looking at the GOP margin by asset type for the UK. So an overall profitability picture, despite all the high ADRs and revenue increases, the overall profitability picture shows the struggle across all classes and leaves us with a clear picture of the current situation as we head into the new year. There is a lot of pressure here. And again, any support that we can offer in terms of understanding your cost impacts by department versus your competitive set so that you can find the opportunities, please do let me know. As we head into the busiest months of the year, the more detailed and impactful the data that you have with the ability to create reports for yourself, the more targeted your teams can be within their cost management. And I just wanted to show you a snapshot of what hoteliers have access to in terms of overall performance. In red, this year versus last year, under the financial ratios at the bottom of the hotel's benchmarking page. We see at the bottom hotel revenue there, 167 versus 142 last year. So that's 167 in 2023 versus 142 in 2022. So that's up by 18.5%. And that's all pretty much been driven by rooms revenue and some other revenue holding up the profitability against those headwinds that I've shown you. The dilution of ADR with cheaper segments is just not one really that hotels are able to entertain. And we can see that despite those big hikes in overall revenue, we're still not really able to improve GOP, just holding the status quo versus last year and 3 percentage points back actually on 19. So it's time to make sure we've all got a grip on that detail because it will make all the difference when it comes to decision making. If any hotels would like to know a little bit more about onboarding or access to data, please just let me know. And that is where we are. Thank you very much. 27 minutes. I think I'm in a good place there.
Very efficient, Catherine, very efficient. Thank you very much for that. There's some really interesting bits in that I learned a lot, which is good. And it was every time I saw a graph that was looking like it was not upward trajectory, I was like, great, this looks like good news. And sadly, it was increasing costs or something. But always good to have all these facts at our fingertips so that we know where we are. And we do have a couple of questions. One is, with the Hotstats data, how can we be sure we're comparing apples with apples? I guess that's about competitive set. Do you want to just quickly answer that one?
Yeah. Yes, sure. I mean, the importance of the apples versus apples thing, or pears versus pears, is really a crucial one because if you're making strategic decisions based on data, you need to be sure that you're looking at things that are real. So we map every hotel's data to the 11th Uniform System of Accounts, the USALI schedule, and it's a big part of the onboarding process that we take the initial data, 1 month's data that hotels send us, and our operations team and our implementations team map that data to the schedule that is the same as everybody else's. So where you might have food and beverage, for example, thinking of soft drinks, for example, there are some element of soft drinks that is that falls into food and some that falls into beverage. And understanding that is very important, because if you're looking at your food and beverage schedule versus your comp sets, you need to be sure that what you're doing is, in terms of benchmarking, the same as the comp set. So that USALI Uniform System of Accounts Bible, if you like, is crucial. We are expecting the 12th edition imminently. should have the book by the end of March, and then we will be transitioning all hotels onto the 12th edition by January next year. And there are a lot of new areas, particularly around ESG and utilities in that, which are going to be extremely useful, because that's all of those new laws that are coming down the line for 2025, 2030 are going to be requiring that kind of data to be part of the P&L. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, not everybody uses the USALI, but it can be
No,
a great
absolutely. Yeah.
way
Yeah.
to go.
So if you don't use USALI, it doesn't matter, because we will map the data to those schedules.
Right. Okay. That's useful to know. So I've just got a couple of questions coming very quickly. We've got 5 minutes left. So there's one here just asking about the security of their data. I guess it's if the hotel are giving you their data, how can they be sure that nobody else is seeing their specific data other than you?
So there are very strict rules around the building of comp sets, so which are kind of globally understood. You have to have a minimum of 4 hotels in your comp set. No one operator can have more than 50% of the rooms. That's just in terms of how security around the fact that nobody can see your specific data. But in terms of how the data reaches us, there are 3 kind of ways that can happen, whether it's through a secure platform called Kiteworks, or whether it's an SFTP folder, which in accounting terms is basically that your hotels put their data in a certain place, and we securely then go and take it. And then, of course, there are API options as well, which where we're taking the data, and we have an open API between ourselves and your finance system, so it doesn't actually get sent anywhere. So there are various ways of doing it depending on what sort of data, what sort of finance system you use. We are ISO 25000 approved, and that's a very important part of our security brief for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've actually answered this one. I'll just read it as it is. Some of the competitors put a service charge as a revenue and distributed as a payroll cost. How do we know that we compare the data apples to apples? So I think you have more or less said that through the USALI and people doing it. But of course, the whole service charge thing is a big topic in itself. And if we get onto that, you'll never shut me up. So that is a big topic.
There is an important part of, within the labour schedule, there are 6 lines there. So all of those service charges, those have to be broken out. That would be part of the onboarding process, is a conversation. It's why if you're looking at room segmentation, because I didn't show that schedule, but we have a whole all of the segmentation is very clearly detailed, and that's part of the onboarding, is to agree that what you're seeing in your PMS in your hotel is not necessarily where that segmentation will sit within as per USALI, but that's the important bit, because it's for benchmarking, so that you really know that what you're seeing your comp set doing and what ADR they're charging and what their revenue mix is how that is versus what you're doing and what you have.
Brilliant. Thank you. Very succinct. And then the final point, someone just asking if it's possible to share the presentation. So yes, we will be doing that. We always record all of our webinars, so we will just do a tiny bit of editing to make sure that everything is coming across well, and then it will be on our website afterwards. If you do have further questions, please continue sending them in. They all still record, and I can send them on to Catherine. But really, we're at the few closing moments now. So I'd just like to thank you all for listening and for your questions. And we will get back to you on any unanswered ones, and any that you want to send in afterwards is fine too. Thank you very much to Catherine. And then, just as I always say, please remember that the opinions and the stats presented today are those from Catherine and the Hotstats team. If you need formal advice, then please do approach your professional advisors or come to me at HOSPA for a referral. I'm sure Catherine and her team at Hotstats would be delighted to hear from you directly too, and I'm happy to make that introduction. Please take a look at our website for any other upcoming events. There are quite a lot in the future, so keep an eye on those. And whilst you're on the website, you will find recordings of all our previous webinars and masterclasses on hospa.org, and also on our YouTube channel. So do have a look at those. And as I said, this one will be there within the next few days. But just leaves it to me to say thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. And we're finishing spot on 11 o'clock, I think. So thank you all very much, and thank you, Catherine.